This is a TalkStation original podcast.
Our first article for this morning has to do with something that happened before you were even around.
Yeah, and you'll know a little bit about my age just by the name of this article. Now that you know I wasn't around, it says 55 years later, we must remember Kent State to not repeat it. This article comes from Religion News, and it is written by Jeffrey Salkin. And here's what he writes. He writes some of the lyrics from the late folk singer Phil Ochs in When I'm Gone. He says, "There's no place in this world where I'll belong when I'm gone." And the author of the article says, "I found myself singing it as I walked through the Woody Guthrie Center in Tulsa and its neighbor, the Bob Dylan Center. Both are worth a trip to Oklahoma." The Guthrie Center houses archives on the life and legacy of Ochs, who had a formative influence on my life. He died far too young and far too tragically. As I sang When I'm Gone in Tulsa, I remembered the many times I sang it at college coffee houses, but I also remembered singing it at a religious service. My confirmation ceremony 55 years ago on Shavuot in May 1970. Why was that song part of the service at which we confirmants, about 100 kids, wore black armbands? He says, our confirmation ceremony was 2 weeks after members of the Ohio National Guard shot and killed 4 unarmed students at Kent State University on May 4th, 1970. The students were protesting the U.S. invasion of Cambodia during the Vietnam War. 9 other students were injured and 1 was paralyzed. He writes, "We felt the horror and loss most acutely. Our synagogue was in Montauk, New York, and many of us were from Bethphage and Plainview, the hometown of Jeffrey Miller, one of the slain students. He was only 4 years older than we were, and many of us knew his family. Miller, Allison Krauss, Sandra Lee Schuer, and William Schroeder were the victims. They were 19 and 20 years old. 3 of the 4 were Jewish. And on the day before she was killed, Krauss put a flower in a National Guardsman's rifle, saying, 'Flowers are better than bullets.'" So as the author writes on, he says this: had those 4 students lived, they would be 75 years old now, maybe grandparents, perhaps even great-grandparents. 2 were killed because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. They weren't even protesting. And the Kent State students were not the only students to be killed on an American college campus in May 1970. Because 11 days later at Jackson State College, now it's Jackson University in Jackson, Mississippi, police confronted a group of black students protesting. They opened fire and killed 2. Philip Gibbs, a junior, 21 years old, and James Green, 17, a high school senior. 12 others were wounded. At the time, President Richard Nixon's President Commission on the Campus Unrest, which studied the deadly campus incidents, stated of Jackson State, quote, "The 28-second fusillade from police officers was an unreasonable, unjustified overreaction. A broad barrage of gunfire in response to reported and unconfirmed sniper fire is never warranted." Unquote. The college named the area of the shootings Gibbs Green Plaza. We remember Kent State. We do not remember Jackson State. And he says, now 55 years later, I observe May 4th as the Kaddish of American innocence. That day, we realized there were no guarantees of safety. We learned academic sanctuaries of colleges could not keep us safe. And over the decades, we learned that public schools could not keep us safe. Neither could religious sanctuaries provide us with metaphoric bulletproof vests. So it's very interesting hearing this piece because it's not just historical, but it's also a little reminiscent, obviously, for the author. And my question to you is, what are your thoughts on this as somebody who was alive then, as opposed to me?
This will tell you something about my age as well. I had just turned 10 years old when this happened. And let's see, if I'm correct, your daughter who's with us in the studio this morning, you want to say hello to everybody? Just say hello.
Hi.
Hi. She is getting ready to turn 10, so I was
She
about
is.
her age when this happened. The event of Kent State, I do not remember. But what I do remember was on the evening news for months afterward that this was one of the top stories, trying to figure out how did this happen. I do recall that during that time, there were a lot of protests on a lot of college campuses all around the country. And it's easy to look back on those and say, oh, but these were young people expressing their opinions, and almost glorify what happened. And yes, this was an opportunity for them to say, this is how we feel, and to stand up for what they believe and try to bring about change. But it wasn't all pretty. Like we see from this, there was tragedy. And Kent State was a real tragedy. If you were to do an online search for the Kent State Massacre, you would find that picture of the girl placing the flower in the end of a rifle, and it's a picture that kind of encapsulates the whole way the country was.
I have seen that
time.
picture, and it is very iconic.
You have these people who are the flower children, and then you've got the armed militia from the government coming in and killing innocent children. And that's the way that the story was presented by the media then. And it concerns me when I see what a powder keg our nation is sitting on right now. We do have different protests that are happening. Some are on college campuses, some are not. We look at what all occurred with the Black Lives Matter protests over the last few years, and how violence became the answer on both sides of the issues. And God did not create us to live in a world of violence against one another. When God created man and woman and he started the first family in the garden, what's the first thing that happens? The children, the second generation, go out and kill each other.
Yep.
Right away. That's what happened. Isaiah talks about a day when God is going to judge between the nations. God will settle disputes for many peoples. They'll beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. I looked for that day, but I don't see that day coming anytime soon.
Doesn't feel like it, does it?
No, it does not.
No, just like you were pretty keen on showing the difference between Adam and Eve and just first generation. Then you got Cain and Abel. Of course, then you got Seth, but he's not part of something as exciting as Cain and Abel, I suppose. It seems like things get worse from generation to generation, and that's not to say God's not present in it, but it's like we never truly learn. We never truly get the horror of how bad it was for the generation prior, and then we tend to create or recreate our own issues. To be honest with you, I know that the book ends in the Bible, but it feels like the book of Judges has just never ended, because we're just in a bunch of cycles where we all do what's right in our own eyes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you look at the history of the nation of Israel, when Israel and Judah separated. Okay, you just read these lists of kings. Here was this king, and he was really good, and everybody followed God, and everything was great. And then he died, and this other king came, and he was worse than the worst king they'd ever had. And then this other one came, and he was so bad that he died, and nobody really cared.
You know where I think we really go wrong with that, and I spent 12 years as a youth pastor before being a lead pastor. I just think we do a bad job of passing on to the next generation the important things. Mm-hmm. Discipleship does start at home. It's up to us to share these things, not just spiritually, but also to remember the history. And I think that's also why in the Old Testament, God made it such a big deal where he said, tell your children about these things. Tell them and tell the next generation, because if we don't, they'll forget it and they'll replicate it. So it's not just telling them stories from yesteryear. It's important that we pass on these things. It's somewhat of a biblical mandate.
Yes, it is. And one of the things I think we can learn from situations like Kent State and Jackson State, although it wasn't Jackson State at that time, right?
Right.
Is that people can have differing opinions.
Sure.
But violence is not always the right way to solve those differences. Actually, I don't know that violence is ever the right way. When you have violence, somebody takes the first violent act.
Yep.
At Kent State, was it the National Guard that took the first violent act? I don't remember all the details. I was 9 years old. But I knew that the world was a mess.